This video is inspired by real events and the account of Zana Musin. Certain scenes and elements have been modified for storytelling and dramatic effect.
This narrative draws from real-life events, taking inspiration from Carmen bin Laden's memoir Inside the Kingdom, My Life in Saudi Arabia. While certain elements and scenes have been adjusted for storytelling purposes, the essence remains rooted in truth. The visuals are digitally rendered to symbolize the setting, not depict actual photographs. Picture opening your eyes in a grand residence. Polished marble underfoot, gilded chandeliers overhead, walls so thick they swallow every sound you make. But imagine realizing that none of it is truly yours, not even your own will. That was my existence. I am Carmen bin Laden. Yes, that bin Laden, but this isn't Osama's tale. This is about what it feels like to wed into one of the world's most influential, secretive, and profoundly conservative dynasties. And the slow, painful understanding that you've entered a lavish prison with no simple way out. I grew up in Lausanne, Switzerland. My father was Swiss, my mother Iranian. My childhood was open-minded, cosmopolitan, intellectual. I lost myself in French literature, visited art galleries, dreamed of traveling freely. I never expected my path would lead me to a land where a woman couldn't leave home unaccompanied by a male relative, where public laughter was frowned upon, and where individuality was hidden beneath layers of black fabric. But love can obscure reality, especially when it comes cloaked in luxury, charm, and exotic allure. I met Yeslam bin Laden in Geneva in the early 70s. He was tall, poised, soft-spoken, an educated man who seemed to defy my assumptions about traditional Arab men. I was young, idealistic, convinced love could overcome any barrier, but when he proposed, I didn't hesitate. I believed I was marrying a modern man. What I didn't yet grasp was that even a Western-educated bin Laden remained firmly bound to the family's rigid rules and religious obligations. At first, our life in Geneva was everything I had hoped for. We had a daughter, Wafa, and I delighted in motherhood. But change crept in quietly. Yeslam began mentioning family duties, traditions that had to be upheld. And then the day arrived when I traveled to Saudi Arabia to meet the rest of his family. I was unprepared for what awaited me. Saudi Arabia in the 1970s was another world entirely. Streets were subdued, monitored not just by police, but by religious enforcers. Women were fully covered, music was outlawed, public joy was suppressed. There were no cinemas or theaters, no dancing. And within the bin Laden compound, life was even more strictly controlled. The wives stayed out of sight, speaking in hushed tones, watching their children through curtains. When I arrived, they regarded me with wary eyes. I was too foreign, too independent, too unaccustomed to their ways. The family was vast, dozens of siblings, uncles, cousins. But the most striking aspect was the hierarchy among the women. Wives were not equals. They were ranked by age, fertility, obedience. A woman's value often came down to how many sons she bore. Failing to meet those expectations could mean being replaced. Polygamy wasn't merely tolerated, it was the norm. Many of the women learned to survive in quiet suffering, knowing they weren't their husband's only partner. I quickly realized I was under constant scrutiny. Everything I said or did was reported back. I wasn't allowed to leave on my own or speak freely. Even playing music or reading Western books that drew disapproval. At night, lying in bed, I questioned the choices that brought me here. I loved my husband and daughter deeply, but I couldn't love the life I was expected to accept. And soon, I felt something unfamiliar. Fear. This fear wasn't just for myself. I worried for my daughter. I couldn't bear the thought of her growing up in a world that silenced her, where her dreams would be crushed the moment she became a woman. I watched the other bin Laden children, well-fed and neatly dressed, yet bound by emotional shackles. I knew I had to act, But how does one flee a family with wealth, power, and connections that span continents? How do you escape when you're constantly watched, even beyond Saudi borders? I began keeping a secret journal, hidden in my luggage, documenting everything: names, dates, conversations. I was gathering the one weapon that might one day set me free: the truth. At the same time, I began to see darker aspects of the family. Even then, there were murmurs about Osama. He was a young man then, devout and consumed with the idea of jihad. While other boys played soccer or studied, he memorized scripture and spoke of martyrdom. At first, no one took him seriously. But I saw the intensity in his eyes, a spark that would one day set the world ablaze. Despite everything, I stayed. Fear held me back. Hope that Yeslam might change kept me there. And the belief that I could somehow endure it for my daughter's sake, that I could protect her by surviving this life behind a veil. But each day stripped away a piece of my identity. Every rule, every silence, every stifled thought felt like dying in slow motion. Yet, I wasn't alone. Across Saudi Arabia, countless women lived the same way, not walled in by bricks, but by tradition. Silenced not by threats of violence, but by unspoken expectations. Many never found a way out. Some never even realized they could. But I refused to let that be my fate. I didn't know how or when, but I knew one thing: I would find a way to leave. I would fight, not only for myself, but for my daughter. Because even inside a gilded cage, the heart still longs for freedom. And that was only the beginning. When I first entered the Bin Laden world, it felt like stepping into a realm dripping with luxury, yet stifling in its silence. I had been raised in Geneva by my Swiss mother, a world that, even when strict, offered me room to breathe. I was a modern woman in a place where modernity wasn't seen as dangerous. But once I married Yeslam bin Laden, I lost that freedom. My name was no longer just mine. It became part of a legacy I didn't yet grasp. A name that inspired both fear and respect in hushed conversations. Yeslam was charming, worldly, fluent in several languages. I truly believed he was different, that I wouldn't have to sacrifice who I was to be with him. But over time, subtle changes appeared. He began by encouraging me to learn Arabic. At first, I thought it was reasonable, even thoughtful. But it was more than that. It was a way to pull me away from what I knew. I had been dazzled by private planes and designer dinners and polished manners. I hadn't realized that every jewel came with an invisible shackle. His sisters were draped entirely in black, their faces barely visible behind layers of cloth. They visited quietly, rarely speaking. Even their greetings were hushed. I remember once offering my hand to one of them in greeting. She recoiled, not out of rudeness, but because she wasn't permitted to touch her brother's wife. To them, I wasn't just foreign. I was a walking act of defiance. Still, I clung to the hope that love would transcend cultural boundaries. I wanted to believe that our marriage would remain ours alone. But slowly, the walls began to close in. As time passed, Yeslam began to sound more and more like the very traditions he once seemed to resist. His easy laughter faded. He grew colder, preoccupied with appearances and family expectations instead of our connection. I tried desperately to hold on to the man I thought I had married. But he was changing into something else, a reflection of his secretive, powerful lineage. And then there was Saudi Arabia. Nothing could have prepared me for what I saw in Jeddah. It was as if I had traveled not just to a different country, but to a different century. Men in white robes lined the streets, while women drifted like shadows, nearly invisible, yet always watched. The rules were unspoken, but absolute. No public laughter, no driving for women, no mingling between sexes. The dry desert air felt less oppressive than the weight of these rules. We stayed in a residence that could only be called a palace. Marble floors, gleaming gold details, ceilings higher than dreams. But I wasn't allowed to step outside alone. I couldn't talk to guards without permission. Even though the surroundings were beautiful, they were a cage all the same. Inside the Bin Laden compound, the women didn't talk about emotions. In truth, they didn't talk much at all. They were raised to endure, not question, to exist, not live. Many had been married as teenagers to men much older than themselves. For them, it wasn't just custom, it was survival. I met women who had never seen the ocean despite living near it, because they weren't allowed to. Their lives were reduced to meals, childbirth, prayers, and silence. I tried to stay strong for our daughter, Wafa. I wanted her to have choices, to know her mother didn't give up without a fight. But I was beginning to realize that resistance had a cost. The more I pushed back, the more Yeslam's warmth turned into ice. He began to control our finances. He would disappear without explanation. He spoke to me with contempt, as though I were a nuisance he had grown tired of. But what frightened me most wasn't just Yeslam. It was the system that protected him. In Saudi Arabia, a woman couldn't travel without her husband's approval. She couldn't file for divorce unless he agreed. If she tried to run, she could be forced back. Under the law, she wasn't a full person, but property. And that's exactly what I was realizing I had become. Someone's possession. I remember one night in particular. I was sitting in a guest room, unable to sleep. The windows were sealed tight. The heat clung to me like punishment. I heard the hauntingly beautiful call to prayer echo outside. But instead of peace, I felt only captivity in a land that saw my voice as dangerous. That was the moment I knew my daughter was in danger too. If I didn't find a way to escape not just the house or the marriage, but the entire world surrounding us, she would grow up believing silence was normal, that being hidden was expected. She would become one of them, veiled, quiet, controlled. That night, I made a promise to myself. I wouldn't let that happen, no matter the risk. I would protect Wafa from the prison that my life had begun. I would find a way to break us free, even if it meant defying an empire built on silence and fear. From the outside, the Bin Laden name meant prestige, vast wealth, and power that reached across continents. But from the inside, it felt like a shadow I could never escape. I had married into a family admired for their ties to the Saudi royal court and their massive construction empire. Yet, that same family name would one day become synonymous with terror. I was starting to understand why. Yeslam rarely talked openly about his relatives. He'd mention brothers or cousins in passing, but without warmth. There were dozens of siblings, half-brothers and half-sisters, children of the patriarch Mohammed bin Laden's many wives. When the elder bin Laden died in a plane crash, his fortune was split among them, granting them enormous influence. But what I slowly discovered was that while the family projected modernity in business, inside their homes they clung fiercely to the most rigid traditions. Women had no voice, no matter how wealthy they were. Education was limited. Their role was to obey, raise children, and never question the men who ruled them. It became painfully clear I would never truly belong. I wasn't Arab. I hadn't been taught to submit. I didn't know how to nod silently and accept what was demanded. The other wives eyed me with a mix of caution and pity. I wore Western clothes, spoke my mind, and insisted on decisions about my daughter. These weren't virtues here. They were flaws that needed correction. But there was one name they spoke of only in whispers: Osama. He was one of Yeslam's many half-brothers. When I first heard about him, he was a young man in his 20s, quiet, devout, and already extreme in his beliefs. He was pulling away from the family, embracing a rigid puritanical version of Islam. He didn't care about wealth or comfort. His goals were far more ominous. I once asked Yeslam about him. He dismissed it with a shrug, calling him a fanatic who had gone too far. At the time, I didn't think much of it. In such a large family, there were bound to be a few black sheep, but over time, I noticed something unsettling. Even Yeslam, who prided himself on being liberal, would fall silent when Osama's name was mentioned. That silence said more than words ever could. As Osama became involved with militant groups, the family publicly distanced themselves. But in private, there were whispers of admiration. Some respected his unwavering devotion, his rejection of the West. That terrified me. I began to see our family name as not just powerful, but dangerous. And I was raising a daughter who carried it. Wafa was growing older. She was smart, curious, outspoken. I wanted her to live in a world where her dreams mattered, where she could choose her own path without fear. But I could feel the walls of our world closing in around us. Yeslam began insisting she learn more about her heritage. He wanted her to dress more conservatively and spend more time with his deeply traditional relatives. I pushed back. I reminded him she was still a child and deserved to make her own choices in time. But he didn't see it that way. His voice turned cold. He reminded me that under Islamic law, the father had the final say over the child's upbringing. Those words haunted me. I realized then I wasn't just arguing with my husband. I was fighting an entire system that saw me as disposable. I remember one visit to Geneva, when two of his relatives spoke in Arabic, not realizing I understood every word. They questioned whether I had converted properly, whether I was raising Wafa the right way. One of them said bluntly, "She's too free. She'll corrupt the child's mind." That conversation broke something inside me. I finally understood how they truly saw me. Not as family, but as a threat to their traditions and to their control over my daughter. The Saudi legal system was designed to keep women in their place, and foreign wives had even fewer protections. If Yeslam decided to take Wafa back to Saudi Arabia, I would have no rights at all. She would legally become his property. I started making secret plans. I reached out quietly to lawyers. I researched international custody laws. I hid important documents. I lived each day wearing a polite smile while my heart raced with fear. One mistake, and I could lose everything. But I had something they couldn't take from me: my determination. Yeslam's family might have been born into power, but I came from survivors. My mother had taught me resilience, and I was determined to pass that on to my daughter. I refused to let Wafa grow up in the shadows, silent and obedient. Still, I couldn't ignore the reality that time was running out. Osama was becoming more notorious. His name was starting to appear in intelligence briefings. Whispers of a network called Al-Qaeda were becoming headlines. I knew that when the world finally woke up to who he was, being part of the Bin Laden family wouldn't just be uncomfortable. It would be unbearable. But even before the world saw the danger, I was already living it. To outsiders, our life looked glamorous. Our home in Geneva was filled with art, expensive furniture, all the signs of privilege. But beneath that polished surface was my private nightmare, the fear of losing my child forever. Yeslam had changed. The charm I'd fallen in love with was gone, replaced by cold calculation. At first, I told myself it was work stress, cultural pressures, the burden of being a Bin Laden. But eventually I had to admit the truth. This distance wasn't accidental. It was intentional. He treated me less like a partner and more like an inconvenience to be managed. His control was subtle at times, framed as concern or tradition. He criticized my clothes, then suggested what I should wear. He discouraged my friendships with other Western women, then asked why I seemed so alone. He insisted Wafa needed discipline. Gradually, she spent more time with his relatives, learning Arabic, learning modesty, learning to obey. At night, I would stare at the ceiling, planning. If he tried to take her to Saudi Arabia, how would I stop him? Which lawyer could I trust? Which embassy would help us? I knew the legal system would favor him. Under Saudi law, the father had absolute control over the child. I was just the mother, a foreigner with no rights, so I kept secrets. I hid documents, passports, birth certificates, my savings. I was careful with my phone calls, deleted messages, kept my voice low. I learned to move through my own home like someone navigating a minefield, listening for danger in every sound. But it wasn't only the fear of losing Wafa. It was the suffocating culture I was forced to accept. Every visit to his family meant enduring the same stilted routine. Polite smiles stretched too thin, long silences over meals, careful glances that judged every move I made. I was too independent, too foreign, too outspoken. The other women were kind enough but guarded. They had learned long ago not to speak too freely. Their spirit had been broken early. I was still figuring out how to hide mine. Then the rumors about Osama grew louder. People whispered that he was funding camps in Afghanistan, that he was helping build networks for jihad. He didn't see it as a metaphor. It was his mission. When I cautiously asked Yeslam about it, his eyes narrowed. "He's not our concern," he said flatly. Nothing more. But I saw something in his expression. Fear. Small, flickering, but undeniable. And that fear started growing in me too. It wasn't just about protecting Wafa anymore. It was about confronting the legacy we were living under. I knew I couldn't change the Bin Laden name, but I could decide how I would fight for my daughter's future. I had to choose. Stay silent and hope for the best, or speak up and risk losing everything. One evening, after putting Wafa to bed, I sat alone in the dark, listening to the city noises outside the window. I thought about all the women in the Middle East who had never had a choice. Girls married off as children, women hidden beneath black fabric, women imprisoned for daring to speak their minds. I remembered my own mother, who taught us we were free, and I thought about my daughter. Still innocent, still full of questions. What kind of life would she have if I did nothing? The next morning I began to write. At first it was just notes, memories, my fears. But over time those scribbles turned into something more. A record, a guide, my voice. I knew that one day I would need to tell the truth, and I wanted to be ready. But I also felt the urgency pressing in. Osama's name was beginning to show up in official reports. American agencies were asking questions. Whispers of Al-Qaeda were turning into news stories. I could see the future coming. The Bin Laden name would no longer be known for its wealth or buildings, but for terror and bloodshed. And when that day arrived, who would they see when they looked at us? Would they see me as a mother, a wife, a woman who had fought back? Or would they only see the name? I didn't know. But I was determined to fight for the truth, because it was all I had left. The day I chose to leave was both the hardest decision I'd ever made and the most liberating. For years, I'd been caught in a web of expectations, traditions, and enforced silence. But deep inside, I knew the cost of staying would be everything I cherished most. My daughter, my identity, my freedom. It wasn't just about ending a marriage. It was about reclaiming my life piece by piece. My plan had to be fragile, almost invisible. One slip could destroy everything, not just for me, but for Wafa as well. I kept my thoughts guarded and my preparations hidden. Every detail was carefully considered. Where would we go? How would we travel? Who could I trust? Above all, how would I keep Wafa safe? She was still young and innocent, unaware of the storm gathering around us. On the morning we left, my heart pounded like a drum. I packed quickly, just essentials. A small suitcase with clothes, our passports, and a few treasured items from a life I was about to abandon. I spun stories for Wafa, trying to keep her calm. I pretended this was just another adventure, another chapter in our journey. But inside I was shaking. Yeslam had already left for work. The house was eerily quiet. Too quiet. I paused at the door. the weight of what I was about to do pressing down on me. This was it. No turning back. We stepped into the cool morning air. The city bustled, oblivious to the secret we carried. I hailed a taxi, gripping Wafa's small hand so tightly she looked up at me in confusion. Was someone watching? Had anyone guessed? The thought chilled me. The airport felt like both an escape route and a trap. At check-in, I forced myself to smile as our passports were scanned. Wafa beamed at me, completely unaware of the danger. When the tickets finally printed without question, I felt the tiniest flicker of hope. Maybe this would work. As the plane lifted off, leaving behind the city and the gilded cage I'd been confined to, tears blurred my vision. I was leaving everything familiar. People, places, even the comfort of routine. But the choice was simple. Safety. Freedom. A future for Wafa outside the shadows of my past. Our first stop was Europe. I prayed it would be a place where we could start over. Those early days were filled with fear and exhaustion. I kept checking over my shoulder, convinced Yeslam would find out and come after us. I knew he had the wealth, the influence, the resources to make it happen. But as the days turned into weeks, and we settled into a small, sparse apartment, I finally began to breathe. Wafa adapted so quickly. She laughed, played, asked questions like any child should. For the first time in years, I could imagine a future where she was safe, yet I couldn't shake the guilt. Had I betrayed my husband? Was I selfish? Would my family back home ever forgive me? But deep down, I knew the truth. I hadn't just fled for me. I was fighting for Wafa's right to choose her own life. Even with that relief, the road ahead was far from easy. His family disowned me, they called me a traitor. Threats came in letters and over the phone. I stayed alert, always on edge. But I refused to let them silence me. I sought legal help. I spoke to organizations that assisted women escaping abusive marriages. I connected with others who'd walked similar paths. Their stories gave me strength. I wasn't alone. As months passed, I started writing everything down. The fear, the triumphs, the small victories. It helped me process it all and take back my voice. It was my way of shining a light on a world most people would never see. But the Bin Laden name still followed us like a ghost. The media picked up our story, feeding the public's curiosity. Some called me brave. Others questioned my motives. I had to endure the scrutiny, the endless questions. I stood firm. The truth was my only weapon. Wafa thrived. She was bright, kind, curious. Watching her grow was my greatest joy. It was also my fiercest motivation to keep fighting. Sometimes, in quiet moments, I would think back to how far we'd come. From a palace filled with silence and fear, to a tiny apartment that felt like freedom. The journey wasn't over. It might never truly be over. But with each passing day, I felt more alive. I had escaped the gilded prison. But the Carmen bin Laden story was only just starting. My fight for justice, understanding, and peace was no longer just for me. It was mine to own. Leaving that suffocating world behind, I believed freedom would be a single bright line on the horizon. But the reality was more complicated. Breaking away from Yeslam bin Laden and the weight of his family's name didn't erase the invisible chains that had bound me for years. I carried wounds no one could see. Battles that raged inside me every day. Arriving in the West wasn't the end of the struggle. It was the start of a new one. I had to find out who I was outside the roles forced upon me. I was no longer just a bin Laden wife. I was a woman and a mother trying to rediscover her voice, her dignity, and her sense of self. At first, even the simplest decisions felt overwhelming. For so long, my choices had been made for me. Now I had to decide everything: where we lived, what we ate, how to keep Wafa safe. Each choice was a tiny victory, proof that I was taking my life back. Financial survival was another mountain to climb. Cut off from my husband's wealth and rejected by his family, I had to figure out how to provide for us. I enrolled in courses. I took any job I could find. Slowly, painfully, I built a life that was ours alone. Every paycheck, no matter how small, was a testament to our resilience. But even as we built our new lives, the Bin Laden name trailed behind us like a shadow. Journalists hunted our story. Paparazzi invaded our privacy. Sometimes it felt like living in a glass box, every move scrutinized. Some days I wanted to scream. Other days I wanted to disappear entirely. But I wouldn't let them silence me. Instead, I used interviews and my writing to speak out. Not just for me, but for other women trapped in marriages like mine. I wanted people to see the truth of forced unions, of cultural expectations that turned women into possessions, of the courage it took to break free. Wafa was my strength. Watching her grow into a thoughtful, strong young woman filled me with hope. I wanted her to know she was free to become anything she wanted. Her laughter was my healing. My relationship with Yeslam's family remained severed, the silence between us thick with betrayal. They branded me as a traitor, but I had accepted that price. Breaking away meant cutting ties with people who could never accept me as I was. Even so, there were moments of guilt. I mourned the life I'd imagined, the person I might have been under different circumstances. Therapy helped me untangle those emotions, to see healing as a process, not a single act, but a winding path. Legal battles followed. Custody, safety, protection. Navigating foreign courts was terrifying. But every paper signed, every hearing attended was for Wafa's safety and our future. At times, loneliness threatened to overwhelm me. I had left behind a culture, a family, and a life I had known for years. But I sought out the communities of women who had walked similar paths. Their solidarity reminded me I wasn't alone. Together, we challenged the beliefs that had once held us captive. I kept writing. My words were my defiance, my truth, my way of offering hope to women who had yet to find their voice. Writing became my lifeline, a way to make sense of everything I'd endured and to take control of a story that others tried to tell for me. Through it, I could speak honestly, not only about my own experience, but about the hidden realities countless other women faced. The trauma didn't simply vanish because I had left. The scars remained, showing up in unexpected ways. Nightmares, sudden anxiety, moments of deep doubt. I had to learn to forgive myself, not just for leaving, but for staying as long as I did. Motherhood anchored me. Raising Wafa in a new culture was both a relief and a challenge. I was determined that she would have choices I never had. I watched her become confident, thoughtful, eager to explore. She was living proof that love, when free, could nurture something beautiful. My relationship with Yeslam's family never recovered. They saw my escape as betrayal, and their silence was heavy with blame. But I accepted that loss. Freedom came with a cost. And sometimes that cost was letting go of those who would never accept you as you truly are. I also faced constant reminders of the name I had carried. Even in the West, people recognized it, whispered about it. Journalists dug for details. The media sometimes twisted my words, reducing my story to sensational headlines. But instead of hiding, I chose to speak. I used that unwanted spotlight to expose what was usually hidden: forced marriages, patriarchal laws, women treated like property. I refused to let my experience be misrepresented. Instead, I wanted it to be a window for others, to understand how control and violence can be dressed up as tradition, how privilege can be a cage lined in gold. Finding work was its own battle. I had to learn the language, navigate unfamiliar systems, find childcare. I enrolled in classes, took jobs that didn't always match my skills or experience. Every paycheck, every completed course was proof that I was capable of surviving on my own terms. It was exhausting, There were days I cried from frustration, but I kept going, because giving up wasn't an option. I wanted Wafa to see that strength wasn't about never falling. It was about always getting back up. Community became vital. I connected with other women who had escaped abusive marriages, other immigrants struggling to adapt, other single mothers trying to make ends meet. Their stories gave me courage. Their friendships softened the loneliness. Together, we challenged the unspoken rules that tried to keep us silent. Therapy helped me untangle years of manipulation and fear. Healing wasn't straightforward. Some days, I felt strong, ready to take on anything. Other days, the weight of the past felt suffocating. But I learned that recovery isn't a destination. It's a lifelong journey, and each step mattered. I watched Wafa thrive at school, make friends, grow into a young woman who asked questions and expected answers. She was my reason for every risk I took. She was proof that the fight had been worth it. Looking back, I understood that reclaiming my freedom wasn't only about crossing borders or winning custody battles. It was also about reclaiming my mind, my voice, and my right to dream. Even after leaving the Bin Laden world, I had to keep breaking free. From the fear, from the expectations, from the habits of silence. Every time I told my story, I chipped away at those old chains. My writing became more than just therapy. It was my rebellion. It was my promise to other women. You are not alone. You deserve to choose your own life. It was also my promise to Wafa, that her future wouldn't be written by anyone but her. Even with all the progress, I knew the past would always leave marks. Some memories would never fade. But I refused to let them define me. Instead, they reminded me how far I had come. Today, I no longer see myself as a victim. I am a survivor, a mother, a woman who took back her power. My journey wasn't just about escaping one family or country. It was about rejecting any system that demanded my silence. It was about teaching my daughter that freedom is a right, not a privilege. It was about building a life where truth had value, even when it was painful. I also understood that telling my story could help change things, not just for me, not just for Wafa, but for countless women trapped in places that insist they have no choice. Through advocacy, writing, and speaking out, I hoped to challenge the structures that allowed such oppression to thrive. I wanted to show that women's voices, so often buried in shame and fear, could be weapons of change. And I wanted to remind the world that freedom isn't simple or cheap. It requires sacrifice, courage, and relentless hope. My story no longer ends with my escape. It continues in every choice I make to stay free, in every word I write to reveal the truth, in every lesson I teach my daughter about dignity and independence, and in every hand I reach out to hold in solidarity with women who are still fighting to break free. Because in the end, freedom is not just for the few. It is the birthright of us all.